listening to the On-Call Empath Show.
All right, guys, we are back for another episode of the On-Call Empath, and you guys do not want to miss this episode. My next guest, Dr. Lena Haji, is a clinical psychologist specializing in forensics. She deals with depression, anxiety, personality disorders, and she's been doing it a long time. She's one of the best in her fields, and it is an honor to have you, Dr. Haji. How are you doing today from Miami, right?
I am, well, from New York.
From New York.
New Yorkers have to keep their New York identity, as you can see in the background.
Yeah.
Yes, but living in Miami, correct. And I can't thank you enough for inviting me on this podcast. I'm so excited to discuss psychology, forensic psychology.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was just thinking, like, I've had so many therapists on this podcast, and the stuff that you do is like a little bit different from some of the people that I've had where they deal with families and, you know, just everyday things. You're more into like the correctional, like forensic side of things. Let me ask you, how did you choose that specialty, and why is that why did that interest you to go into that part?
That's a very good question. Forensic and correctional, which are actually a little bit different, but along the same lines, is a very specialized. So, you know, it takes somebody who, I think people who work in forensic and correctional psychology have to adore it, or else it's not gonna work. I knew I wanted to be a psychologist at a very young age. I didn't realize forensic was kind of calling me. My parents worked for the United Nations, so it was drilled into my head at a very young age that I had to kind of pick a profession that helped people and the underprivileged, so to speak. So that was, and I'm grateful for that. You know, my parents were very much think about those who don't have, think about the underserved populations. And when I was about 19, I took a class, a kind of a bachelor's level forensic psychology course called Psychology and the Law. And, you know, this bombshell, gorgeous woman walks in, and she kind of looks like a Barbie doll to stereotype. And she's talking about serial killers and sex offenders. And she reminded me of Clarice from Silence of the Lambs. And I thought, I'm sold. If this, you know, gorgeous woman can work with serial killers and murderers, like this is it. And so then I just kind of pursued that path from then on. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of us, like, we think like on TV show, on crime scenes and stuff like that, you'll go testify in court. Like, you have to prepare that yourself, right? Like, you have to go to court, you have to go in front of a judge, and you do the assessment on pretty much people that are mentally unstable or not. Is that kind of some of the parts of the job that you do? Or
yes, that's part of it. I actually testified this morning on Zoom court.
There you go.
Wrapping up. Yes. It was an interesting case. It was a defendant who has a traumatic brain injury, and they're trying to figure out if he has a history of violence. So it's more of a question of, is he a danger to society? Does he need to go to a psychiatric hospital versus prison? So that was very interesting. Yes. So forensic psychology is really anything having to do where psychology intersects with the law. So correctional psychology is more in the prison system, which I did that on and off for 20 years. So it's more people who have already been convicted, they're already serving their time. And that's more a little bit more treatment oriented, and risk management, a lot of risk management. Whereas forensic psychology is more having to do with the legal process. So competency, not guilty by reason of insanity, sex offender risk assessments, violence risk assessments, sentencing assessments, and I can go on and on, but that's pretty much the gist of forensic and correctional psychology.
Yeah. I mean, were you into this when you were growing up? Did you watch crime shows, or like, this is like very fascinating to me. This is like a treat because I don't have too many people on the show that have done a lot of the stuff that you have. I'm sure you have a lot of crazy stories, which we'll get to at the end. So guys, stay tuned for that. But yeah, did you like kind of like have any courses like going to high school and college, like any legal classes, or did you just kind of?
Not really. I mean, I still, to this day, the amount of forensic television that I watch is not okay. It's unwell. I remember the first prison that I worked at, I was like 23. I had a bachelor's degree. I had no idea what I was doing. And I used to come home and put on like Forensic Files or the First 48 or whatever, Law and Order. And my mother used to say, don't you get enough of this at work? And I was like, no. I mean, I've watched every serial killer documentary, every forensic show you can, and I'm still like that. I mean, people ask me like, don't you want to watch a comedy? And I'm just like, absolutely not.
Yeah. I mean, there are podcasts dedicated to like crime scene and stuff like that. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people out there that are listening and tuning in, like, like Silence of the Lambs, when they went to just kind of do evaluation on the prospect where he was behind bars. Do you ever, is that kind of accurate? Do you have to go to the actual facility and do that, like with someone that's like absolutely restrained?
Well, so I like, yes. So Silence of the Lambs is actually pretty well done. And Anthony Hopkins played a psychopath, fantastic to the T. And psychopathy is one of my areas of interest, expertise, if you will. I provided training on psychopathy. But yeah, I worked in the prisons for 20 years. So when you're in the prisons, I mean, you're in the prison, the mental health unit might be away from the inmate cells, but I've been in cells with inmates. I've been cell side with inmates. I've had riots break out, fights, stabbings, suicides, people getting high. I mean, I do have a lot of stories. And due to HIPAA, you have to still, even though they're state property, which is a horrible term, even though they're incarcerated, they still have privacy rights. So you cannot have a correction officer with you at all times, unless it's, they're really deemed dangerous or a violence risk. But yeah, being alone with inmates, 20 years I did that. And I still do that. Yes.
I'm sure you got a lot of stories. And
I do.
I mean, being like more in the female with all males, like I'm sure that's got to be a little intimidating, like coming into a place like that, but you're probably used to that, right?
I'm used to it. Yes. I think the bottom line is people think, they think inmate and they just kind of put them in this box. And really inmates are humans. They're, yes, you have some more violent, some that are high ranking gang members, some that are psychopaths.
Yeah.
But really they're just humans. So the best tool you have when working with inmates is your gift of gab. You treat them with respect. 99% of them will treat you with respect. A lot of inmates are people who kind of just took the wrong path. They have mental health issues. They have substance abuse problems. They do have a history of trauma. They had low socioeconomic conditions. And so, we have to remember they're humans. And as long as you treat them with respect, not all, I should emphasize that. You do have your, ones that are really out there and ones that are just very psychopathic and don't care at all. But most of them, you treat them with respect, and you command respect. You say, just because I'm a woman in an all male facility does not mean you can treat me any other way, way you wish. And so respect and boundaries and consistency. And once they see that in you, they're very likely to
kind of like it's earned, like respect is earned.
Right.
Well, cool. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, but before I ask you the next question, I want to let everyone know, if you're having any mental health issues or any serious health issues, you definitely go see a qualified physician or a therapist. We're just two people talking on the podcast, so I just want to throw that out there. So let's dig in right here. I think this next question, I think a lot of people are confused about, so I want to kind of get it out in the open. What is your take on the misconceptions of bipolar disorder and narcissism? Because it seems like a lot of times people just Google it and be like, oh, they're a narcissist or they have bipolar. And we both know it's like a spectrum. It's not black and white. If you can kind of explain that and just set the record straight.
Yes, absolutely. This is a great question. Both bipolar disorder is more organic. It is organic, meaning it stems in the brain. There's an actual chemical neurological imbalance, which means that it is typically treated with medication. So there is grandiosity, if you will. There can be grandiosity in the manic phase of bipolar disorder, AKA when somebody is manic, AKA they're high because they're going through a manic phase. They can have grandiosity, high self-esteem, need for stimulation. And so they can present as narcissistic or having a huge ego, but it's really neurologically based. Whereas narcissistic personality disorder is very different because it is a personality disorder. And a personality disorder is a pervasive characterological pattern. So it's more ingrained in their personality. It's not neurologically based. There's no medication for it. It's more, an inflated sense of self, an obsession with unlimited power and fantasy, interpersonally exploitative, aka they take advantage of other people, but it's part of their personality. It's who they are as a human. Whereas bipolar disorder, it's not exactly a part of their personality. It's because they're sick. If that makes sense.
No, that perfectly makes sense. And one thing I was wondering is, I mean, there is nothing in the books that talks about narcissism. I mean, is it a spectrum? I mean, someone could have these traits, but if, let's say, someone has like 10 out of like 10 traits of narcissism, I mean, does that constitute for someone being like 100% narcissism, or can you be on a spectrum where he has some tendencies, but he has empathy, or
Right. Well, yeah, that's another good question. I'm going to always 100% of the time have everybody, and whether you're a professional or not, or a licensed mental health professional or not, this is the Bible, the diagnostic.
Yes. That's what I was thinking.
Mental disorders, the DSM-5, and it's sitting in front of me, not just because I knew I was going to be on this podcast, but because I literally breathe and eat and live this. So, it's interesting. I actually just posted something about this on my Instagram where, just because somebody has a big ego or somebody has an inflated sense of self or they're selfish does not mean that they meet criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. There is very specific criteria in the DSM, and it is, again, a pervasive pattern. So you can, have a friend or a boyfriend or somebody in your life who's selfish and an egomaniac. That doesn't mean that they have narcissistic personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder has 9 different criteria that have to be met.
Wow.
And so and that's kind of my pet peeve, because you see a lot of people kind of throwing out narcissism, around a lot.
Right.
She's a narcissist. And it's like, no, they might be, sorry if I'm not allowed to curse, they might be an asshole and they might be selfish, but that doesn't mean they have this particular narcissistic personality disorder.
And I tell me if I'm incorrect, but isn't it like 6% of the population, at least in the US? I mean, it's a very low number.
I'm going to once again refer to the DSM, and it says, yes, the prevalence estimates for narcissistic personality disorder in community samples is 0 to 6.2%, which is very low.
Right.
And that doesn't mean people aren't selfish or narcissistic or ego driven. It just means they're not full blown narcissists according to the DSM-5. And also, speaking of gender, in the DSM, it says that 50 to 75% are male. So yes, it's more common among males.
Gotcha. I mean, I was just wanted to clear that record straight, because you hear so much online and people Google stuff. So that's good to know that, these statistics. So we talked about those. I mean, when we go step up a little further, like psychopaths, people that have no conscience, like people like Epstein, like these high profile cases, which is very fascinating to me. In those situations when someone is just lacks like human life, they're just dark inside. Is that like the worst thing? Like, is a psychopath where they don't have any sense of self, and they just don't care if other people, if they hurt other people? Like, in your opinion, like, what does that entail?
Psychopathy is fascinating to me because it's not as well known as you would think, because psychopaths in media for a very long time have been kind of just painted as serial killers, or, your Jeffrey Dahmer, your Ted Bundy, your Epstein. And really, there's a whole body of research coming out on what they're now calling successful psychopaths.
They're all CEOs, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's a little more alarming, because even though psychopaths may not have any empathy or any conscience, or however you want to operationalize it, that doesn't mean that they're all criminals, and it doesn't mean that they are all hurting people per se. If psychopathy is directed towards pro-social behaviors, which is really the only treatment, they might be a CEO or an attorney, or they might work on Wall Street, which is where Dr. Robert Hare, who is the psychopathy expert, talks about how, they don't necessarily have bodies in their freezer, right? They can be politicians, and I will stay out of the political, because once
that's another podcast.
That's another podcast. But they can definitely be politicians and high-ranking CEOs, and because those positions still kind of satisfy that need for power and grandiosity and admiration and the narcissistic component and the rush and the, all of those things that psychopaths tend to strive for. So yes, to answer your question, is it the worst thing? I think it's the worst thing if they're active in criminal activity, for sure, because they're never going to feel differently.
Sure. And there's no treatment for that, correct? Who's going to admit they're a psychopath?
Yeah, they're a psychopath. They're a psychopath. So it's interesting, because the treatment for psychopathy used to be what they called insight oriented, right? So it was kind of teaching them they would have, for example, meetings with their victims or family members of victims to try and instill remorse and empathy. And that turned out to be horrible, because they are incapable. They are neurologically incapable of feeling remorse and empathy for other humans. It's just the way they're hardwired. And so what they found was that with this insight-oriented empathy treatment, psychopaths were getting worse, because what they were doing, and I talk about this in my webinar, what they were doing was they were mimicking human emotion. So they were going before the parole board and pretending they felt sorry, or pretending they had remorse, and pretending, and they became better psychopaths, essentially. So when it comes to treatment, really the only treatment is behavior modification. So instead of hitting everyone anytime that you feel like it, maybe you, I don't know, clean up the litter at the beach. I mean, this is a very oversimplified example, but it's really redirecting the behaviors, because the internal is, thus far, 2022, we have not found a treatment for the insides of a psychopath, if you will.
It's just so interesting stuff. Like this is what I just do on my free time, just study all the different kinds of ways in psychology. So I have to ask you, this is a curveball. If you can kind of tell me, you have, let's say you're working with two different people, two different ages. One's 19, one's 65. They both committed the same crime, murder, or the worst heinous crime ever. Obviously, there's different treatments. There's different avenues. What is the main difference between someone that's maybe older and versus somebody that's just maybe juvenile, or maybe 18, around that adult age? Would they be treated differently, and what would the treatment look like?
That's a very good question. And I think age is just one of the factors. When it comes to psychological treatment, we're really taking a biopsychosocial approach these days, which means assessing the biology, the psychology, and the sociology, right? So the 19-year-old, does he come from a low socioeconomic background? Does he have an education? Why did he murder? Was it an impulsive murder? Was it a defense murder? Was it a psychopathic murder? What purpose was it a gang affiliation? Whereas the 60-year-old, was it, and I'm stereotyping here, but was there a sexual component? Was it revenge? I mean, there's so many reasons why somebody might commit a murder. So instead of just looking at age differences, which of course play a role, you would have to look at the whole entire picture. The education, the mental health history, is there drug addiction, is there trauma, and what are we trying to treat exactly? Are we trying to treat violence risk? Are we trying to treat impulsivity? Are we trying to treat anger? So we really have to individualize the murderer, so to speak, and then come up with what are we trying to treat? What is the problem and what are we trying to treat? And that's why I always stress evaluation. I think too often times we go right into treatment, but we haven't really evaluated. You know, you can't treat somebody without evaluating them. And the evaluation goes a long way. Yeah, a long way. And it's very underrated in my opinion.
So your evaluations are obviously like golden to like going into court and stuff. That's what they go off of based on your opinion, correct?
Correct.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. So I wanted to just kind of save this last question for the end, but I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, like, you know, how common is the insanity plea? Like, let's say somebody did a heinous crime. Is a very low percentage that people get off on that, but like you see all these high profile cases, for instance, Epstein and all this stuff, like they have money to buy the best lawyers and get the best people. In your opinion, like, is that something that someone can use? Like, do you see people using that plea a lot, or is it very hard to prove that someone's insane?
So it's very Hollywoodified because it makes for great TV and great movies, right? I always watch something that has the insanity defense because it's so interesting, like you said. The statistic that I have heard, and it could have changed, it could be different now, but I heard that less than 1% of all criminal cases attempt to go for the insanity plea. And of those 1%, only 1% of that 1% are found actually not guilty by reason of insanity. So it's extremely rare. You wouldn't think that, you know, watching forensic shows and movies, but it's extremely, extremely rare. For what they call NGRI and not guilty by reason of insanity to have that be a plea and then to have that actually be the reason that they committed a crime. It's very rare. And it's hard to prove because you're basically assessing their mental status at the time of the offense. Right. You know, it's not like a competency to proceed to trial, for example. You're assessing their mental status at the time that you're talking to them. Do you understand legal proceedings? Whereas an insanity defense, you're actually assessing their mental status at the time of the offense, which is very difficult to do, obviously, because it's in the past.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's like where I live, there was recently a school shooting, and the kid was 17, I think. But I think that's what they were going for. I don't know if that's even possible for a juvenile to, you know, I don't know what the case, like the facts would be like for somebody to shoot up a school and then go for like the insanity case, like being underage. Like, I don't know if there's a big difference being an adult or under, 18 years old, but I'm sure there's a lot of components to that.
Sure. I'm sure it would be I'm sure it would be more likely to fly with a juvenile because, who really wants to convict juveniles when they're young and their brain isn't fully developed? And that's a big component, that their brain wasn't fully developed.
Sure.
That being said, and I've been doing actually a lot of evaluations recently. It's just mind blowing that this is where our country is, but I've been doing school shooter evaluations. It's like a thing now where I get these referrals of these high risk students who have threatened to shoot up a school, or they found a diary with a plan to shoot up their school. I come in and evaluate to see if they are an actual threat or if they were just venting like an adolescent.
Right.
But the case that you're talking about,
it was in Oxford, Michigan.
In Oxford. Okay. Yeah. I mean, they would have to prove, to get a gun, go to a school and murder people takes a lot of thought.
Premeditation.
Yeah. So how can you really
know? Yeah.
It's kind of hard to say unless they were floridly psychotic and delusional and they really thought somebody was after them, or the government was implanting chips in their head and telling them to do something of that nature along those lines. It would be really hard to prove an insanity defense, I think, because it's like you said, it's so premeditated.
Yeah. So let's talk about like stress, just kind of ending it on a note. Like, I know you've probably had some hard cases. If you can think about the work that you've done all these years, is there something that sticks out that you want to leave us with? Like anything that you might want to just tell the audience, like maybe something personal that happened to you, or maybe something to how to deal with somebody that you're not sure if they're a psychopath or a narcissist, like, because I know that we do that a lot of people just go ahead and start labeling, and they have no business doing that because they're not trained to look at all the criteria,
Right,
and
right.
they have to go to someone like you who can just
Right.
be like, no, they're not a narcissist, they're just a shitty person, like, you know.
Right. He's just an asshole, like he's not a narcissist. He's just not a nice person. And guess what? We come across a lot of those, and that doesn't mean that they are mentally ill.
Sure.
You know, as far as on a last note, gosh, there's so much I would love to say. But yeah, my main point is, you know, there's so much misinformation out there.
Mhm.
So social media makes it so easy for people to just come to their own conclusions and Google symptoms. And I'm guilty of it too. You know, we're all human. We have constant stimuli. You know, I've had a headache and I've Googled and been like, okay, great, I have a brain tumor and I'm going to die. You know, like, I don't think it's that, you know, people are smarter or dumber. I think it's just human. You know, I think that, you know, something personal, I've dealt with my own battles a lot throughout my life, especially in my earlier life, you know, and even though I won't go into detail, I really would like to end the stigma around mental illness,
Sure.
you know, depression and anxiety and other things that I've gone through, even a history of trauma. And I've managed to, you know, come out somehow the other side. And I think that, you know, I also want to point out that having mental health problems is an explanation, but not an excuse. And that sounds harsh. But, you know, our suffering is not our fault, but our healing is our responsibility. And I think that a lot of people are saying, you know, mental health is becoming so vogue and so trendy that people are kind of saying like, well, I don't want to take that test at school because I need a mental health day. And it's like, no, that's called life. That's normal anxiety. Everybody, you know, experiences that. And unless it's like really clinical depression or clinical psychosis or bipolar, one of these more serious mental illnesses, I think we need to be very careful with how we're throwing around the term mental health.
Yeah. I mean, that's like a buzzword nowadays. Like, you know, so, I mean, even with like a lot of my content, I'm be careful, like, you know, just labeling somebody as something concrete, because you just don't know these days, you know. So it's been a true honor to have you on this podcast. You are like very knowledgeable about this subject, and your expertise has just blew me away. Like your Instagram, you guys definitely check her out. So before we leave, can you just tell us where we can find you and what you're up to? I know you're doing webinars and things like that. So go, if you can just let everyone know like where they can find you.
Sure. And this was an absolute pleasure. I can't thank you enough for having me. And I'm going to tell everybody to check out this podcast for sure. So my website is www.risepsychological.com. And if you go to webinars, there's a really interesting webinar on psychopathy and one on malingering, which means faking mental illness.
Yep.
You can get 3 CEUs if you're a licensed professional in Florida, but even if you're not, even in mental health, they're very layman friendly, and they talk about psychopathy and malingering. And then my Instagram is at Rise Psychological Services. And so, yeah, check me out. I would love to hear from you guys and hear what else you want me to talk about. I'm always looking for ideas.
Yeah, you guys check her out. I'll have all the links in the bio. Stay tuned for the next episode, and we are out.
Listening to the On-Call Empath.